In this video, I'm going to talk about monopsony and the monopsonistic labor market. Monopsonies, or a monopsonistic market, is a market where one firm dominates the market and is the sole buyer of a resource like labor. This means in order to attract more workers, though, firms must raise wages. So we talked about perfectly competitive labor markets and their perfectly elastic supply curve. And when they want to hire more workers, they simply just hire more workers at the prevailing wage rate because they can supply all they want at that, they can hire all they want at that wage. The best example of a monopsony is the NCAA. In terms of top-level, talent for college players and college-age players, it's pretty much the only place that student-athletes can go after high school to get to hone up on their skills to get ready for possibly entry into the professional field of their sport. The NCAA is currently kind of getting in trouble for keeping wages down, quote-unquote wages of their scholarships and their stipends that they're allowed to give out. And, of course, laborers are upset when there's not many options and their wages are held down. Especially with the NBA one-and-done rule in college basketball and then the NFL's 3-year rule of being in college, it really limits choices for the individual worker. And that's really what they are, is they're really laborers who are vastly underpaid in many sports, especially the big revenue-generating sports of college basketball and college football. Because there are few alternatives, the NCAA is able to keep wages down because what are the players going to really do? With football, there's really no other option other than going to college. And some of those places that college football players play, hold 100, 110,000 people, for 6 or 7 Saturdays a year. So they're generating a lot of revenue for the school and for the program. So their MRP is extremely high, but because of the monopsony situation, their wages are kept relatively low because there's not very many options for the workers for the student athletes to go to. With NCAA basketball for men, it's a little bit different because kids can go to the Euro leagues, but that's not very enticing because as an 18-year-old, you lived in America probably your entire life, and heading overseas isn't a great option, it seems like, Think about you guys right now going to, and maybe some of you have gone to Greece. But imagine like uprooting and going to Greece and having to live for a year in a country where you don't speak the language and you have, you don't know anybody. Even in college basketball, you probably know through AAU, some of the players that you might be playing with or on other teams, and so you're just familiar with America. So the NCAA knows this, and for years have just kind of kept scholarship and quote-unquote wages for players way down. And that's one of the problems of a monopsony market, is that without other options, for the most part, players, student-athletes, workers just have to kind of take the wages. Another example would be the Pullman Company in Chicago, but many of you probably don't remember the Pullman strike. But basically it was a company town where the Pullman Company owned kind of all of the necessities. They owned all the housing, they owned all the stores, they were the sole pretty much provider of labor in the square blockage that they owned. And so workers were basically forced to work there because there weren't very many other options. So monopsonies, to kind of build on your prior knowledge, are kind of like monopolies backwards. So monopolies are kind of like monopsonies backwards. So with a monopoly, we said there is no supply curve because they're rent-seeking, they're profit-seeking. So they're only going to produce the quantity that maximizes profit. So for monopsony, them being now on the demand curve, the firm, there's no demand curve because the firm can hire exactly the amount that maximizes profit, and they don't have a willingness to hire any other quantities besides that. For monopoly, the marginal revenue was less than demand, and so on the supply side then, from the firm's standpoint, the MRC is greater than the supply, and that's a mathematical certainty, just like the MR and demand relationship. Monopolies are price makers. They make a price above competitive, and so monopsonies are going to be wage makers. And if you could make a wage as a business, you would make a wage that's below competitive. So they're wage makers, but the wage goes down in this case. Monopolies are the only seller, while monopsonies are the only buyer. And in a monopoly, there's many buyers of what they're selling. And for monopsony, there's many workers, there's many sellers looking to sell their labor or their resources to a monopsony. So when we look kind of side by side with the PC labor firm and a monopsony firm on the right, the PC labor firm faces a perfectly horizontal supply curve as they're able to hire as many workers as they want at the wage that the market sets. And then they have a downward sloping demand equals MRP because of diminishing marginal productivity. And so where MRC meets MRP, that's the quantity that that competitive firm is going to hire. For a monopsony, again, it's kind of like a monopoly backwards. So there's no demand curve, so this downward sloping curve is MRP, not demand equals MRP. Still, the idea that marginal productivity is downward sloping. And then we have the idea that the MRC is greater than the supply. So in terms of the hiring decision, firms will always hire where MRC equals MRP is the quantity, but that's not going to be the wage that the monopsony hires. So in order to get this many workers to show up, you go to the supply curve to figure out, well, here's where it meets the supply curve, and this is the wage the monopoly is going to use to hire at. If the monopsony hired up here at this wage, then this many workers would show up, and that's way more than the firm wants. So the firm doesn't hire at that wage because of that. Now, at this stage as well, we have a nice deadweight loss triangle that's created because it's not allocatively efficient. So there's my deadweight loss triangle because the firm is under hiring this resource. And the other thing that comes up about monopsonies is the competitive market. So what if this were a market, a competitive market? Well, then the firm would hire where the supply curve meets the demand curve. Now, obviously, here's the supply curve. There is no demand curve, but we can substitute in the MRP. So where these two curves meet is where the competitive wage would be and the competitive amount of workers hired would be, coming from that where the supply and demand or supply and MRP curve meet. So those are really the three things you need to know about monopsony graphs. The monopsony wage and quantity, the competitive wage and quantity, and then the deadweight loss. Now your teacher will kind of show you the finger trick for this. But the idea is that the monopoly then faces a downward sloping demand curve, so MR is below it. And for a monopsony, the supply curve is upward sloping, so mathematically the marginal resource cost, the MRC, has to be above it. And again, you can kind of see how the deadweight loss triangle, in the monopoly, the firm underproduces from a socially efficient standpoint, and from a socially efficient standpoint, the monopsony underhires because the competitive market would hire more and society would obviously want more workers to be hired at a higher wage, which would be more competitive. Last up, in your package, you probably have 2011 Form B, a monopsony graph. So try your hand at that now. You can take a look at your notes, obviously, and kind of work towards identifying and answering all those questions, and just kind of realize that barely anyone in the country got question C2 correct, which are 2 points. One is the quantity, and there's obviously some multiple choice there. And then the second point was even more missed because it was an explanation of why that's true. So if you get stuck on C2, not a big deal, but hopefully you can answer all the other ones.